Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ILHAM and this afternoon's program, a special talk on colonialism, class, and caste in plantations with Malaysian economist Professor Dr. Jomo K Sundaram, moderated by writer, researcher, and curator Ong Kar Jin. This talk is in conjunction with ILHAM's current exhibition, The Plantation Plot. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome the speakers to begin the program.
Hi, everybody. So I'll just start with a short intro to Jomo. I mean, most of you probably already know his work, but I'll do a short intro for the benefit of everybody. So I think most of you know that Jomo is obviously one of Malaysia and Southeast Asia's most respected economists, and he's had a long career that bridges academia, activism, policy, and I think very notably, he was at for many, many years, and then later on went to the UN to serve as UN Assistant Secretary General for the Economic Development, and then subsequently as Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development at the Food and Agricultural Organization. And of course, some of you may know that he was a founder of the Institute of Social Analysis in Sun, which has published many, many, many books about socio-economic policy, social issues, and more in Malaysia. And he's authored and edited so many books, over 100 of them, including works such as A Question of Class, Capital, the State and Uneven Development in Malaya, Rent-Seeking and Economic Development, Theory and the Asian Evidence, and many, many more. But I think Jomo, and I think you will see today, I think one of Jomo's greatest strengths is that he is not a narrow-minded economist at all. In fact, I think I would hesitate to pigeonhole Jomo as an economist. I think he's one of the broadest-minded thinkers I've met, and is incredibly interdisciplinary. So I think he has delved into areas such as making a comic book, writing activist statements, getting banned from Singapore, getting in trouble with Malaysian billionaires and cronies over the years, and also I think broadly thinks about not just economies but systems of social development, extraction, and also the colonial legacies that we live with. And of course, I think today we are talking about the plantation plot, the global plantation, and I think this is kind of funny because it's reflected in Jomo's own name, which is Jomo Kwame Sundaram. And Jomo is obviously from Kenya's Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame from Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, and Sundaram is a Tamil name. And so, I joke that, to fully encapsulate the global plantation history, maybe, Jomo, you should consider adding a Rodriguez or a Dubois to your name. Then you can capture the full global plantation. Anyway, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jomo to start his talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kajin, and thank you to Shaza and especially to Rahel for making all this possible, and to Shao for inviting me to be part of this exhibition which she has so ably curated. I also want to acknowledge the help of not only Kajin but many others in terms of trying to contribute to helping to prepare the slideshow which I have today. I was originally going to make this presentation much shorter, but thanks to their efforts, their collective efforts, it's going to be perhaps much more. But I also hope much more interesting and much more entertaining. I'm very humbled by your presence today, and especially by the number of people who expressed an interest to come, but were not able to come. And I do hope that that you will have access to it through the recording which ILHAM will make available. Rahel is especially qualified to be part of this because her late father was my colleague at the university was actually originally part of the Faculty of Agriculture in the University of Malaya, which no longer exists because it was taken away. But there was a time when the world and Malaysia took agriculture quite seriously. We will, in a sense, harken back to that. But in a sense, what we will do over the next hour or so is to go back a little bit. I have to start this. I'm not going to do a performance performance, but Ja Rastafari. Now this, for those of you who do not remember, is the last emperor of Ethiopia, Haile Selassie, arguably the last emperor of the world, because I don't think we still live in the time of emperors. Although, for those of you who read my economics columns, I've been writing about the Orange Emperor, and that the Orange Emperor has no clothes, particularly in his competition with what others might term the Yellow Emperor. But this picture is of the Emperor Haile Selassie's visit to Malaysia in the early 1970s, before he was overthrown in 1974. And the urban legend has it that Haile Selassie visited Malaysia and arrived at the opened Subang International Airport, moving from the Sungai Besi Airport. And as he was driven through the rubber estates in those days, which were later replanted with oil palm, before it was opened up as it is now. And that night at the official state dinner, it is said that he said how thoroughly impressed he was with visiting Malaysia, that even your jungle grows in rows. Now, this is an image of Enrique, Prince Enrique, sometimes referred to as Enrique the Navigator, or Henry the Navigator. And Prince, of course, he was from Portugal, and those were his various minions who were all part of the royal entourage. But Enrique was, in a sense, the first conquistador of that period. Even before the Treaty of Tordesillas divided you might remember the very corrupt Pope Alexander VI from the Borgias. He divided the world at Tordesillas between Portugal and Spain, and one has to remember that Portugal was not conquered by the Arabs, and it had a much stronger military presence, naval presence, especially before the unification of Spain in 1492. And Henry was called a navigator, but I seriously doubt his navigation abilities. But more importantly, he was the first conquistador. He conquered parts of Morocco, or Maghreb, as it is known in Arabic, and was very, very important for the development of the world for well over a century, I would argue. This is another very major figure from the same times, or slightly later. This is none other than Cristobal Colon, originally from Genoa. And Cristobal Colon, of course, is well known as the man who discovered the New World. But all this was with a purpose. And I would emphasize that the purpose soon became clear. And it was what was very significant in those days, the spice trade. And the spice trade had a lot to do with the preservation of food, because that was the foremost significance of spices in the old days. And it is interesting to note that as a historical coincidence, the second next time Malaya boomed was with tin mining much later, and tin mining, of course, was triggered by the American Civil War, and the Larut War triggered in turn the Larut War in Taiping and so on. And last year, of course, was the year of the 150th anniversary of the Pankor Treaty. But the Larut Wars were important because the significance of tin was that there was a first huge increase in the demand for tin, precisely because the American Civil War was the first war fought using tin cans. So rather than go in and steal all the food you could from the farmers nearby, you basically had canned food with the American Civil War. So this was extremely important. But I want to also emphasize the nature of the people who dominated trade in the early years after the Iberian period, the Spanish and Portuguese period. And here we have an image done by Rembrandt. And Rembrandt's painting of the Night Watch is very important, of course. It is very much celebrated as a great work of art and so on. But take a look at this image for a moment and contrast that with what it probably really looked like. And this was the image, black and white, looking like people from the Quaker Oats advertisement, or the image of Massachusetts. And this was how the real image of the ruling class. And this is why people like Max Weber write about, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, abstinence, and so on and so forth. But this was the austere character of the guilds. And remember that after the Netherlands succeeded in defeating Spain and the Spanish rule in they created something called the Dutch Republic, and it was during the Dutch Republic that you had the period, the beginnings of Dutch Empire. So one has to remember that the relationship between empire and monarchy is not a simple, straightforward relationship. You can have empire without monarchy, and the Dutch Republic reminds us. So if you go back to the image, this is Rembrandt's characterization of the same people we saw in the earlier image, and this is important for us to remember precisely because they had an inflated sense of their self-importance. They wanted to look heroic. They were coming back from war. They were looking very, very magnificent in all these fine colors, and the light which Rembrandt casts is directly on the people in the center. This is how they saw themselves, and this is how they really were. So I think it's very useful for us to see how people look upon themselves, look upon their self-importance, and this is expressed, of course, in commissioned works of art and so on. Now, this was a piece of work which basically captures the ships of that time. Now, if one looks at the naval history of the world, one will be quite actually impressed by how sophisticated, for example, the Bugis ships were. The Bugis ships were extremely sophisticated. This ship you see is a Dutch ship, and the Dutch ship has 3 masts and quite a number of sails. But the most sophisticated Bugis ships actually had 11 sails, okay, on the 3 masts. And this is extremely important because it reminds us of the maneuverability of the Bugis ships. So while it was possible for the Dutch to outmaneuver the Portuguese, and it's very interesting to remember that the beginnings of international law are often associated with a man named Hugo Grotius. Hugo Grotius was a young prodigy, and in his teens he wrote a legal opinion justifying the piracy, the act of piracy of a Portuguese ship just off Singapore by a Dutch ship. Okay, so remember that the origins of law, of international law, which we revere so much, and which the Netherlands government now reveres by insisting that every single international legal organization be headquartered in Den Haag, is precisely because of Hugo Grotius, who actually, when he fell out of favor, had to be smuggled out of Amsterdam in a box together with books covering him so that he wouldn't be discovered. And Huig de Groot, as his name originally was, had to run to Paris, converts to Catholicism, and reinvents himself with a Latinized name, Hugo Grotius. And that's where the origins of international law lie. So remember that international law is not something so wonderful which drops from heaven or something like that. It is actually in acts such as the acts of piracy and so on, which reminds us of what is happening today with international law and the selective application of international law. So there's nothing sacred about all this, and I think all this reminds us. Now this is a beautiful piece with the VOC, which is the Dutch name for the East India Company of Holland, which was established shortly after the English East India Company, but grew in prominence much, much faster and became very, very significant, precisely because of the role and the importance of spices during this period. Now, this is, the Dutch are very famous for making great deals, business deals, right? And this is a deal I want to remind you of. And I used to joke with the current queen of Holland when she was still a princess. She's an Argentine woman, and that this was the worst ever business deal the Dutch ever made. It's an exchange for an island called Run on the left, and some of you may have seen the exhibition by Ahmad Fuad Osman last year, where which I'll show you an image of later. But Ahmad Fuad Osman marks this exchange of Run for Manhattan on the right. Okay, and this was over 360 years ago. And was obviously a very bad deal for the Dutch, with the benefit of hindsight. But at that time, it was a great deal. It was a great deal because Run was the site of the production of most of the most expensive, the most valued spices of the time. And this, I think, is very important because when we think about Maluku, Run is, of course, part of the island, the Banda Islands, which are in turn located within Maluku. And Maluku, of course, in Arabic script, have the same initials as the MLK, Min Lam and MLK. So you have the possibility of if you're reading the text in Jawi, you may well mistake Maluku for Malacca, and this has become a source of constant problems in historiography, depending on such sources. But this is an important reminder. Now, Banda, of course, has been the subject of a book by Marjolein van Paghi, I'm not sure how to pronounce the name, and it's about the genocide by the Governor General of the Dutch East Indies, Jan Pietersen Koen. Okay, and this book has been translated and published in Indonesian, but it's not yet published in English. I think it has been completed, but hasn't come out yet. This is, of course, Koen, and Koen basically kills or orders the killing of well over 9,000 Banda Islanders, especially on the island of Run, which I mentioned earlier. Now, this is the exhibit by Fuad Osman, whom we'll come back to later in a completely different incarnation, called Archipelagic Alchemy, which was done last year and which was curated by a Filipino, one of his Filipino collaborators. So these are the islands, the Banda Islands, okay? And this was from an exhibition which Shao and Kajin did, and Noel Rodriguez also was involved with 3 years ago. I mainly remember it because after watching the exhibition, I was coming down wearing my shoes, which had not been worn during the pandemic, and my shoes, the soles of my shoes, I lost my sole there. So anyway, so now this is an image of Toussaint Louverture. Some of you, many of you may not be familiar with Toussaint Louverture, but Toussaint Louverture is the man who fought for and defeated the French in Haiti. And this was over 2 centuries ago, and it was a very historic struggle. And the book by C.L.R. James, who is a wonderful, wonderful writer, is actually called The Black Jacobins. And The Black Jacobins is a very interesting book, because here we have the slaves of Haiti invoking the promises of the French Revolution, particularly the Jacobin branch, whom many people celebrate to this day, and invoking them and turning them on the French. And of course, the French came down on them very hard, and until earlier this century, the Haiti, despite being one of certainly the poorest country in the Caribbean, if not in the Americas, Haiti was still paying reparations to the French for defeating the French in this period. So now this, of course, is a one rendition, and this, of course, is Louverture dying in the following year in a prison in Haiti. Now, this is another image which I want to. I doubt there's anybody who was my student at UKM when I used to teach there, but I used to require students of economic history to watch this film, and UKM actually has a copy of this film. It's a film produced by United Artists, okay, the company set up by Charlie Chaplin just before he was banned from entering the United States. Charlie Chaplin set up United Artists, and this film was given. Gillo Pontecorvo won the Oscar for the best film for Battle of Algiers in 1968. So after winning the Oscar, without seeing the film, they gave him more or less a blank check to make a film. And he made this film, which is variously known, especially in the Americas, it's known as Quemada. And I had seen it as Quemada, but it's also now better known as Burn. Okay? And it's basically about an island, and there is even mention of Malaya in those days. Particularly of Slim River and a few other places which were locations of new companies, especially rubber planting companies. So here you have the connection with the plantation being invoked once again by Gillo Pontecorvo in this film with Marlon Brando. So here you have Marlon Brando in the film, and I think the representative of the old slavocracy, and then Brando basically encourages a revolt against slavery, and he basically there's this memorable scene of him trying to persuade the mestizo community on the island to join the revolt against the slaves, because it was basically a slave-led revolt initially, but join the revolt and support the revolt against the slaves in favor of replacing slavery with wage labor. And wage labor, he argued, was far more efficient. Why should you pay for slave children to be brought up to become slaves later, and why should you take care of the slaves when they are no longer productive? Instead, higher wage labor. It's much more efficient. They will be producing. They will be much. It's much more efficient. And he does this in the town hall and upstairs in the town hall, facing a brothel. And he compares the brothel and the efficiency of the brothel to the inefficiency of being stuck with a partner who's no longer considered sexually desirable, and so on and so forth. But of course it's done with a certain degree of sophistication and so on, and it's a very important image. So after this, after the successful slave revolt, the end of slavery, you have wage labor. There's no more role for Brando. Brando goes back to London. He becomes completely irrelevant, gets drunk, and before he's then rehired and brought back to the island, because by this time you had a revolt of wage labor, and this was considered to be too reminiscent of the Vietnam War. So the film, after it was produced and was quite well received in the early screenings, was suppressed and never generally released. So it's very difficult to find this film. I think by now, of course, it is there are pirated copies on the internet which you can watch and so on. But it is a very interesting film with the context of conquest, of the themes of conquest, of slavery, of plantations. Now this, of course, is Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass, of course, was one of the most articulate writers in the mid-19th century about the condition of African American people, and he writes very, very powerfully about their condition, and he was, of course, a very important campaigner. Now, this is somebody else whom many of you might recognize, more familiar name, invoked by none other than our current Prime Minister, namely Malcolm X. Okay, so Malcolm X very famously, among other things, spoke about different conditions of different workers on the plantation. And most importantly, he makes the distinction between the field nigger and the house nigger. The house nigger being the one closer to the domestic life of the slave owners, and basically much more compliant, much more cooperative, and so on and so forth. And he makes very important distinctions about the characteristics of the house nigger and contrasts them with the field nigger, who's much more rebellious, who has less skin in the game, so to speak, and is much more likely to revolt and so on. So this is a little picture which I took exactly half a century ago to this month. It is in Western Massachusetts, and the only reason it's here is because I took the picture. But it just reminds us that plantations can look very different. This is a tobacco plantation. Okay, so as you're thinking of plantations which look different with lots of trees and so on and so forth, here is a very different looking plantation in the form of a tobacco field. Now, this is a book by Mahmoud Mamdani, and the main reason is because Mahmoud is a wonderful writer from Uganda, but currently teaching at Columbia. But more importantly, it reminds us that there are different types of colonialism. And in this particular context, I think it's important for us to remember that the condition of settler colonialism is quite different from the types of colonialism we were subjected to. So most of us in the tropics are actually were subjected to colonialism, as we know. But in the subtropical and semi-temperate areas, instead of colonialism, you had a settler colonialism, where the conditions were much more conducive. Of course, you hear people getting Nobel Prizes because supposedly in the tropics there was, the tropics were unattractive to the Europeans, and the mosquitoes and so on made life miserable for them. But if you look at the design from the Institute of Planters, no less, in this country, which still exists, the Institute of Planters would recommend designs for how you organize a plantation, and at the top of the hill, which in the plantation you would have the manager, of course, and then further down you would basically have the hierarchy of the plantation being replicated by the residential hierarchy on the hill. And this, I think, you can find for those of you who know, for example, the plantation Bangi Estate close to UKM, as well as other some of the older plantations in Johor and elsewhere. You will find this kind of residential configuration, which is reminding of it. But it's also important for us to remember that even in the subtropical areas, life was made more possible for the managerial elite by having by keeping the capitals of these colonies often in hill areas. So, for example, Nairobi, the capital of Kenya, which Kar Jin referred to earlier, is actually on a plateau, about 800 meters above the Mombasa, for example. Or if you look at Harare, formerly known as Salisbury in Zimbabwe, now Zimbabwe, in those days Rhodesia, that too is on relative highland, and in the old days, the African workers were kept at a safe distance from the capital. It took almost an hour by bus to get from besides moving around within the communities, it took another hour just to get to Salisbury. And you see this, of course, in some of the townships in other parts of southern Africa, and so on. Of course, one can well argue that even Addis Ababa is quite high up, but for that matter, the Ethiopian, almost all of Ethiopia is quite high. So that's not a very good counter-argument. Now I have to pretend to be an economist today, so here I am reminding you that Raoul Prebisch and Hans Singer argued over 3/4 of a century ago that the terms of trade against primary commodities have a tendency to continue to get worse. And I would add somebody else, because we couldn't find another comparable graph, but basically Arthur Lewis from the island of Santa Lucia. Arthur Lewis made a similar argument, arguing that the terms of trade for tropical agriculture were declining have been declining for when he made the argument in the 1960s, it had been declining for a century and a half. Bilge Erten, the Turkish economist, has extended the analysis of the data, and basically argues that both the Singer-Prebisch argument as well as the Arthur Lewis argument extends well into the early 21st century. So basically we've had the evidence suggests about 2 decades of these trends going against primary commodities, but especially against agricultural primary commodities, because as you know, mineral primary commodities have not suffered the same fate, and very importantly as well, tropical primary commodities have been especially hard hit. Now, this is another wonderful piece by Fuad Osman, whom I referred to earlier. He obviously, if you look, anybody who visited his retrospective of his career, there were 7 different phases, 7 different genres of art which characterize Fuad's work. But this was from a relatively recent work, and this, just in case you don't know, is supposed to be Enrique. Now, who is Enrique? Some of you may have grown up on the writings of Harun Aminur Rashid, who was a historian, a very influential historian in the 1920s and 1930s, who had popularized the work of people like Hadi Hussein, who had basically turned Winstead and Wilkinson on their heads by rewriting the history of this part of the world differently. And Harun Aminur Rashid popularizes the image of Enrique. Now, Enrique was the name which was entered into the records in Sevilla before Magellan left Spain under Spanish auspices to go to circumnavigate the world. Now, remember that Magellan, at that time known as Magalhães, had participated both in 1509, when the Portuguese first arrived here in Malacca, and in 1511, when the Portuguese conquered Malacca. So he captures the young Enrique, captures him, takes him away as a slave, and then a decade later, Enrique comes back with Magellan, and basically Enrique eventually secures his freedom by after Magellan is killed in the island of Mactan. For those of you looking for a Malaysian connection with the island of Mactan, the richest man of Malaysia, Robert Kwok, owns a hotel called the Shangri-La, which is in Mactan. And a man named Lapu Lapu, which is the name of a grouper in the Visayas of the Philippines. Lapu Lapu basically kills Magellan on the island of Mactan after Magellan basically kills a couple of villages on the island of Mactan because they had refused to accede to his demand for, 1, accept his God, number 2, accept his king, and number 3, most importantly, pay up. Okay? So, you might laugh about this today, but I can assure you this is at the heart of what Mr. Stephen Miran, the chief economic advisor to the US president, describes as the Mar-a-Lago Accord. There's no accord involved. It's basically, an extortion record. But that's basically what's involved right now. So Enrique, basically, some of you might think that he suspiciously looks like Johnny Depp, but Enrique basically, this is a life-size thing, and is still to be found in Balai Seni Lukis, not very well prominently displayed, but it's still there. And it was here briefly during a retrospective on the Magellan part of exhibition with I think Simon Sun was involved in doing the write-up on that. Now let me move quickly now to the more Malaysian story, a more familiar story for many of you. The point about 1786 is just a marker for James Jackson, the late Australian geographer. And 1786, of course, is the year when Penang is founded. And for those of you who do not know Penang, one of the biggest pieces of property, of public property in Penang is called Padang Brown, or what many people refer to as Dato Kramat. But Padang Brown is also the name. Brown is also the name of the largest plantation on Penang, which is in the Sungai Ara area. For those of you interested, so basically Jackson is referring to the kind of plants of plantation crops which are adopted, and I think it's very important for us to remember that until about a century ago, plantations basically referred to all kinds of farms. It did not specifically refer to large farms as we currently use it. The official Malaysian definition is of 100 acres and above, but that was not always the definition. And the late Unku Aziz pointed out how there were that plantations were subdivided in his what became his PhD thesis, the subdivision of estates. He basically pointed out that to avoid categorization as plantations, you basically divided plantations into smaller lots, at least on paper, juridically, to avoid paying certain taxes and so on. Now, many of us, thanks to the late Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, think that Singapore would not have been amounted to very much if not for the great Stamford Raffles. Now, just to get the history correct, because unfortunately others have also contributed to the myth of Raffles. Raffles was actually not really interested in Singapore. He spent less than 3 months in Singapore. He was really interested in Java. And for those of you who know his work, he contributed 2 large, huge, this size volumes on the history of Java. And history did not refer just to social history or political history or economic history. It also, very importantly, refers to natural history. So you have a wonderful set of drawings illustrating the book, his 2 volumes on the history of Java. And but the point I want to make here, quoting from the deal done in 1819 with the East India Company, was to emphasize that the deal was to establish a factory. Okay, to establish a factory. It wasn't Sultan Hussein was not ceding Singapore. He was establishing a factory. Now, you can say, oh, this was a very far-sighted, it was an export-oriented factory and whatnot, and so on, which of course is the flavor of the day for MITI and many others. But let's face it, it was little more than a factory. Okay, and so there are many people today, for example, who will sing to the cows come home. Maybe I'm expressing the frustration of a failed lawyer, but who will tell you, how wonderful English law has been. If not for English law, we would never have progressed, and so on and so forth. And just to remind you that English law, for those of you who ever studied law in England, you will know very well that the law which operates in this country is not English law. It is colonial law, and particularly in another part of this country, on the island of Labuan, the son of Francis Light, William Light, actually introduced and experimented with something which we call the torrent system. And after it was successfully experimented with in Labuan, it was popularized not only within what we now call Malaysia, but in many parts of the world, including in Australia. So torrent system actually was first experimented with in Labuan, and it was really an attempt to develop new types of land laws which were not encumbered with centuries and centuries of English legal history. So now this is a very early 20th century photograph, of a Gambia and pepper factory, okay? Sorry, collection point in Singapore. Okay, so this gives you a sense of this, and without getting digressing too much into details about the significance of Gambia and pepper and other spices, it is important to note, as many others have done well before me. Lee Poping has written a wonderful thesis on early 19th century Singapore, and the late Karl Trocky has also written a great deal about the development of the Kang Chu system in Johor, which was important because Johor became the main plantation site for Singapore, as Singapore had little land to offer, and there was much more flat land in Johor compared, of course, not only to Singapore, but also to the rest of the country, because the main range basically ends up in the northern part of Johor, and no significant mountain ranges in Johor. So this is useful for us to remember, and one should also remember the basic attitude. Now, this is a quote from I think it's from a newspaper, but it is largely with reference to a book report by Shastri. Shastri's report was in the early 1930s, and it was basically a reference to the fact that workers who had been used in this country, who had been extremely productive and had contributed to building the wealth of this country, were basically being disposed of and being sent back to India, just like as the term at the end of the quotation suggests, disposed of like sucked oranges. So imagine you get your orange. Yeah. Dr. Selvaratnam, who has probably one of the first pioneering scholars of plantation society in this country, corrects me and says this was from a lawyer in Penang. I suspect it was Logan. Yes. Yes. After whom there's still a road named in Penang. Yeah. Okay. So Sucked Oranges became the title of a book which we published over 3.5 decades ago, and this is my oh so subtle attempt to try to convey what was happening in Penang. So basically, you have a discussion of the book itself. Frankly, is much more than what this image captures and the term captures, which is basically what happened in the 1930s with the Great Depression. Now, I want to also give you a sense of what else was happening within the Indian community at that time. And there was a very important Indian reformer named Periyar. And that wasn't his real name. It was a title which was achieved by popular acclaim. Periyar was a very major reformer. He was against caste. He was against the subordination of women. He was against. He was very much for literacy and so on and so forth. Very, very significant. And if you want to get a sense of how significant he was in Malaya, you might want to read the chapter in the late Michael Stenson's book on him, where he discusses the significance of Periyar. But Periyar only died about, I think, in the early 70s. And I still remember after hitchhiking across part of the world, I got to India and tried to see some of his work when I was still an undergraduate. But I was told that he was already quite ill and not in good shape. So he passed away in his 90s, but very, very important. And some of you might wonder why some Indians take caste very seriously and some Indians don't take caste very seriously. And generally speaking, you will find that it is the northern Indians who are much bigger on caste than particularly Tamils. But of course, there have been Tamils, including Ceylonese Tamils, and Periyar didn't have much of an impact in Jaffna as well as eastern province in Sri Lanka. So Periyar's greatest impact was actually on Indian Tamils. But of course, there was relative little immigration by that time during the timing. So Periyar's influence is somewhat circumscribed by that. But if you look, for example, at the work of the Indian Association, which is basically an association of the Indian middle class, and you have the tendency, the Indian middle class, who was of course very comfortable with the elite privileges which they enjoyed, but you also had the Indian middle class who were much more reform-minded, who were uncomfortable with colonialism and so on. And this is very much captured in some of the debates by the Indian associations in places like Penang and elsewhere. Now, this is a famous book on immigration and settlement, and one can say a lot of things about it. It was done by the late Kanya Singh Sandhu, who was also a geographer. And Sandhu basically was very interested in demography, and his book basically reminds us that in the early years of the opening of the plantation economy, death rates were high. And these are young Indian working people in colonial Malaya. And the death rate was about a fifth. A fifth would die every year. So basically, your average life expectancy was about 2.5 years. Okay? You come to Malaya, your average life expectancy is about 2.5 years. Now, many of them, of course, were illiterate, and you do not have very much in terms of records. But these are the kinds of conditions for the first generation. Now, why were people dying? All kinds of reasons. But you could have people dying from malaria, from snake bite, and so on and so forth. But you also have, of course, it is also testimony to the abysmal conditions under which this country was opened up. So it's useful to remember that it wasn't a hunky-dory, as they would say. Now, this is a title of an article by my former colleague, Tunku Shamsul Bahrain, who writes about Indonesian population in Malaya. And it's important to remember that the last group of indentured labor in this country were actually Javanese. Okay? And when I was a young lecturer at University Kebangsaan, I could still hear expressions, derogatory of course, referring to Javanese people of Javanese extraction as Jawa kontrak, you know, and you know, you would hear people being you know, sometimes derogatorily referred to as wak, okay, which was a familiar term. And it's useful for us to reflect a little bit on why the debate in 1926 on the adoption of Malay as the national language of Indonesia is very telling. There were two major reasons why Malay was adopted. Let's remember that at that time, over half the population of Indonesia was Javanese. Budi Utomo was fighting for Javanese to be the language of Indonesia. But at the debate I think it was in Madiun, Shumit, was it? At the debate was decided in favor of Malay as a national language. Even though Malay, the number of Malays in Indonesia was less than 2%, but the Malay language had spread, thanks to Sriwijaya and so on, And as the book Early Indonesian Commerce by the late Walters tells us, the early Indonesian commerce was largely done by Malay-speaking peoples, okay, from much of Sumatra. So, so the original use of the term Malay, that's why I think it's very important for us to recognize that the use of Malay is widely contested. It's not a simple, straightforward thing. So when, for example, Jose Rizal and many of the Philippine nationalists identify as Malays, it is a statement of their nationalism. It is a statement of their identity as being part of this region, and this is quite crucial. So, so it's very important, I think, for us to reflect on how these categories, ethnic and other categories, have changed over time and changed in significance over time. I could not find a comparable work on Chinese indenture. It's important to acknowledge that Chinese indenture started off primarily for mining, okay, not for plantations, but it remains significant. And there are also very important books, work on this, and there's also very important work reminding us that the kind of schooling on plantations, whether for Indians, for Tamils, or for Chinese, or for Javanese, were always very, very restricted. The whole idea was to keep them, pick up a little bit here and there until you're ready to start working around the age of 12 or so. That was the function of schooling in the early years. There's quite a bit of work on this. Marimutu's work, for example, testifies to this, but there's a lot of other work looking at other ethnic groups on the nature of schooling in the colonial period, and including the late colonial and early post-colonial period as well. So I want to bring this book, The Rubber Industry, to your attention for a variety of reasons, but most importantly, I think it is important to remember Lord Bauer, Peter Bauer, did the study of the rubber industry in the 1940s, or at least it was published in the 1940s. He may well have started earlier. Now, Lord Bauer ended up as a great supporter of Mrs. Thatcher, okay? But Lord Bauer was also, very importantly, very firmly in favor of competition. So he wanted the price of rubber to go down through competition from the smallholders. Because basically, the way the British had set things up, the whole system favored the plantations over the smallholders, and in various different ways, which I cannot get into right now. But it's important to remember that the character of what is now called the economic right has changed. Bauer, Thatcher were talking about competition. Peter Thiel, number one supporter and booster of President Trump, announced in 2014 in an article in the Wall Street Journal, competition is for losers. If you want to make money, go for monopoly. That's the way to go. Okay? So this is very important because the way the economic system has changed and law has changed is that you now have all kinds of so-called legitimate ways of conferring monopoly powers. Most importantly, of course, is something called intellectual property rights, but there are a whole variety of other means of doing so. So it's a very important reflection for our times as well. Now, during the 1940s, there was a tremendous struggle, particularly since most of the working people in this country were on the plantations, a tremendous struggle being waged on the plantations. And this is a man on the one on the left is the same person as on the right, a man named Ganapathy. And Ganapathy was executed by the British colonial authorities. He was the leader, the president, I think, of the Pan-Malayan Federation of Trade Unions, the PMFTU. Okay, a very legitimate organization. And he had found a weapon and he was going to submit the weapon to the police authorities, and for his troubles, he was arrested and executed. Okay, for having possession of the weapon he had found, and he was going to submit. Okay, so this is how this is your idea of justice, and this was the kind of. So Ganapathy was a very popular leader, and the other leader, of course, is Srinivasan, who was also a very popular leader, who was killed. Yeah, sorry, Veerasenan, sorry. Yeah, how did I get Srinivasan to my head? Anyway, now I'm going to move forward very quickly because I know I'm taxing your patience, but this is a picture of something called Agent Orange being sprayed in the highlands, in the central highlands of Vietnam. Okay? Now what has that got to do with it? I'll come back to it later. Okay. Must have a little bit of suspense like this. Okay, so as you can see here, much of the land is kind of without vegetation, okay? Because what Agent Orange is basically a herbicide. You kill basically plants. And the whole idea of spraying the Central Highlands was because you didn't want anybody to cross from the north to the south or vice versa in Vietnam. So you sprayed it, killed all the plants, nobody could come over. So what did the Vietnamese do? They built tunnels, okay? And some of you going for a tour in central Vietnam, you can go into these tunnels. I can't get into the tunnels, they're too short, they're discriminatory. Obviously they were discriminating against Americans, you know, and I couldn't get in, yeah? Now, so nothing can grow there. Nothing can grow there. So they looked, after the war, they were looking for things which could grow. And nothing can grow until they came across Robusta coffee. And Robusta coffee is the only coffee which can grow there. And now it is the basis for the main economic cash crop in the Central Highlands is Robusta coffee. And Highlands coffee is attempt to make a transnational corporation out of Central Highlands coffee in Vietnam. Okay, now this is the old century and a half old central market in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City. And for those of you who ever visit Ho Chi Minh City, I would encourage you, if it is still the same, go to the central market. It is not air conditioned, and sniff your way to the coffee. And you can sniff your way from the entrance all the way to the coffee booths because it is so strong. But I'll tell you why it is so strong. This is the reason. Okay? Do any of you know what this is? This is kopi luwak. Kopi luwak. Yeah. This is what we call musang. It's essentially a civet cat, and the civet cat there is basically the droppings of the civet cat. Now, what has happened is that, actually I should have reversed it, but basically what happened was that the Vietnamese heard, when the Vietnamese started producing coffee, they did something which we did when we started producing cocoa in the 1980s. We brought down the price by almost 30%. Okay? So when they brought down the price of coffee, they said, oh no. Everybody was cursing the Vietnamese, but what did the Vietnamese do? They said, oh, we heard of this. They heard that there was this coffee which was being done around Lake Toba in Sumatra, and they said, okay, let's make this thing called kopi luwak. Kopi luwak used to be grown in the Toba area and then exported in Katis, yeah, to Penang before the confrontation. After confrontation, it was moved to it was moved to, the site, the markets moved to Singapore. Okay, so at least up to 1963, Penang was the main market for kopi luwak. Kopi luwak in those days was basically collected and cleaned from the droppings of the civet cat, who would eat the fruit, the coffee bean on the pod, and basically the droppings would be collected and cleaned. Okay, so that is still the premium coffee. Okay, still wild. Okay, now you have this musang there. Okay, looking quite sad, pathetic, because their diet is nothing but kopi. Okay, and then they realize that man cannot live on coffee alone. Okay, so now they have varied their diet a little bit. Okay, but basically the diet is principally coffee, and the whole idea is to collect those droppings there, clean them. So if you go there to the market, you can sniff your way and grade. So there's Weasel Coffee Grade 1 and Weasel Coffee Grade 2. Weasel Coffee Grade 1 is basically from the wild. Weasel Coffee Grade 2 is basically from the caged animals. Okay, so this is how you make the most out of adversity. Okay, now this is my best read publication ever. So just in case you think I write boring books, which I must admit to doing, this is the book which I did in collaboration with some cartoonist friends, and it's a novel book because on one side is the story of Mina. It's a composite story of two girls who actually from southern Perak, and drawn by this friend. And on the other side is another story of a boy who lost his arm and eventually got compensated for 70% of his arm, because he lost the arm up to here, so he still had 30% of the arm, so he only got the 70% compensation instead of the full compensation. Okay, now this is a drawing. These are the drawings, and you can see the transition to oil palm had already begun, yeah. And this basically testifies to the role of the mando and the internal oppression within the plantation. Okay. Okay. I have a couple of reminders that the new plantation frontier is not in Peninsular Malaysia. It's really Sarawak. So to explain away why you're destroying most of Sarawak forests, you do it by saying that you're converting them to plantations. Okay, so you basically make money twice in Sarawak through this, and of course the person who has made the most money from that has of course passed away, but we are talking about tens of billions. Okay, and just like 1 MDB, we are never going to see much of it recovered because there is no official effort to do so. Okay, this is a piece of artwork by the late Nirmala Dutt, basically of the Penan. Oh, sorry. This is of logging. Yeah. Okay. This is also by her. Of this of the Penan community, and I think this might be it. So let me stop here and thank you very much for your attention. I hope.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I would just add 2 notes to what Jomo was saying, simply because some of you may not know, but Cristobal Colon, which he referred to earlier, is the Spanish name of Christopher Columbus. Yeah, just in case people didn't know. And Enrique, Enrique, he was referring to, is also referred to as Enrique de Malacca, i.e. Panglima Awang. Just because he didn't mention, and I think people popularly know them as that. But I think I just want to add two notes, really. One about the VOC, and one about Agent Orange. And I think with the VOC, I think in thinking about what Jomo was saying about our inheritance, right? That we essentially live in a society, laws, systems, institutions inherited by plantations in many ways. And the VOC, being that colonial construct, is actually recorded in history. The VOC, along with the English East India Company, is the first IPOs of the world, the first common stock offerings of the world, the first time that people pooled together money and said, let's list this on the market. So we also owe our financial systems to the VOC and the English East India Company. And I think to add to what Jomo was saying about Agent Orange, I think in recent years there's been much more research about Agent Orange, its origins, its development, as well as its continuing legacies. But it's essentially Agent Orange was developed by a company called Monsanto, which today is still very, very controversial, particularly for its use of the pesticide called Roundup, and it's been sued, very controversial for causing cancer, for causing all kinds of illnesses to this day, where people are essentially exposed to all these toxins and exploited. But also that Agent Orange, it's now well recorded that its origins came from Malaya. And essentially, it was first prototyped as an exfoliant, as a de-weeder for rubber plantations in Malaya, as a way of making the rubber plantation easier to manage. And subsequently, it was then tested in Malaya during the Malayan emergency against, quote-unquote insurgents. Which, by the way, we call it the Malayan emergency, but it's now been recorded that the main reason the British termed this as an emergency and not a war was for insurance reasons, because British insurers would not insure the properties of companies in a war. And that's the reason why we don't call it a war, but in actual fact, it was really a war in all senses of the word. And subsequently, this early version of Agent Orange was used in Malaya. It was not deemed very successful because they found that the Malayan jungle was a bit hard to manage and it wasn't very successful against communists here. And then instead we got the BRICS plan. But subsequently, Dean Russ, the Secretary of State, is recorded as having a conversation with JFK saying, hey, they've used it in Malaya, I think we should use it in Vietnam. So in many ways, we are the originators of this today. So I think with that kind of thinking about the legacies of Malaya and the plantation, we'll open up the floor to questions from the audience. Okay, you were saying that JFK during your time.
During my time,
Use the mic, please.
it was
Please use the
discovered
mic.
that the
Please use
Agent
the mic.
Orange, a lot of the guys that came back from Vietnam had,
It's working, it's working.
it's working. Okay, the JFK indicated that a lot of the troops that were coming back from Vietnam were carriers of Agent Orange, and a lot of their offspring had cancers and this type of thing from children on. So this is very interesting that the origins came from Malaysia. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I think with that, we'll open the floor to any questions or anything from people, perhaps. Oh.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. My name is Dewi Fortuna Anwar from Indonesia, and I really enjoyed Professor Jomo's one. There's a lot of things that Malaysia also lent to Vietnam. One of them is the strategic hamlet, which was borrowed here from the emergency to the Vietnam War, which the American practiced. I knew this because I did the Vietnam War. It's my special subject. But my question is, Jomo, one of your slides about the book about neither natives or permanent minorities or something like that. Can you explain a bit more? How contextual is it now if you bring it to the future, to the current one? Or you're not willing to go to become too political?
Thank you very much, Mbak Devi. I will not get into it right now, partly because it's very far away from the topic. In fact, I was almost tempted to drop it last night. But the point why it is very, very relevant, and this is why I feel I need to say something in response to your question, is Mahmoud takes several case studies. Okay, Mahmoud is basically a Ugandan Indian. Okay, and he goes to and then he's expelled. His family is expelled from Uganda by Idi Amin. Okay. And many others as well, including Freddie Mercury, since this is a more cultural crowd. And then he eventually works in different places and goes back. So if you see Mississippi Masala, the film Mississippi Masala, which is a film made by his wife, okay, Mira Nair. So Mira Nair is making this film, and the final scene is he's allowed back after Idi Amin, goes back to Uganda, goes back to his house on the hill. Okay. Now he subsequently has to leave again, and he works briefly University of Cape Town in South Africa. And there again he's confronted by the settler colonial question. And so the settler colonial condition is actually, it's very different from the ordinary colonial. Indonesia experienced colonialism in ways which are perhaps different, even different parts of Indonesia. In Sumatra, for example, you had British capital quite omnipresent and so on and so forth. But in the case of South Africa, the South African condition, of course, was particular, almost unique in many different ways, particularly with apartheid and so on and so forth. But the arguments for example, many people think of South Africa in terms of the white and the African population. But it was actually much more complicated. It's just like the plantation. Okay? So you have the white, but you have two whites. At least two types of whites. You have the Anglophone whites and the Dutch-speaking whites. So the Afrikaner are speaking Afrikaans, which is basically a Dutch Creole language. Okay? And because the Afrikaans, often derogatorily referred to as Boer, a Boer in the English language is somebody without manners, without culture, etc., etc. A Boer in Dutch is a rural person. In English, sometimes it's used that way, but not anymore. So the whole idea is that you have a rural, you are uncultured, you are, and so on and so forth. So they lose to Churchill and the others in the Anglo-Boer War, but then they come back because they have the numbers, and in an all-white society they have the numbers, and they come back and they rule. And apartheid is basically an affirmative action of the Boer, of the Afrikaners, to enhance their position as rural Afrikaans against the Anglos, okay? And of course at the expense of everybody else, okay? But you have a multi-variegated society. So even low standard white people, like people, for example, Portugal, okay? The Portuguese in South African society are not even considered white. They are considered colored. So, for example, the former, what's her name? The former finance minister Ramos is considered colored. Trevor Manuel, considered colored, and so on and so forth. So it's a very complex thing, you know, and I didn't want to get into all that right now, but I think it is the parallel with plantation society is certainly there, but the settler colonial experience in the Americas is quite different. And if you get into the latifundia versus the minifundia in the Americas, again you have very different societies. And then the promises which were made, for example, when you freed the slaves, if you have, when you free slaves, when they have nothing else, their condition can be worse off because they don't even have a certain security and so on. So the settler colonial experience is quite complex. And then, of course, you have this ultimate settler colonial experience, which is basically what you have in 1947, because you basically have the myth that that Palestine is a land without people, for a people without land, meaning the Jewish population, which has been discriminated against and expelled from Europe. Okay, so you know so the settler colonial condition is not a singular condition. Yeah. It's a very complex condition, and there are some parallels with plantation society, but because it has because today we have limited time to talk about plantations, I didn't want to get to it too much. But thank you for your question. I'll be happy to talk to you independently.
Yeah, I think in kind of parallel to the plantation question, I think actually the earliest use of the word plantation in the English language comes from Tudor English times, referring to how Irish people were planted. And as in that use of plantation was actually didn't refer to necessarily, monocrop plantations, but rather some often forceful migration of people from one place to another, and it originates with the Irish. And speaking of settler colonialism, after many of the conflicts with the English, Irish often considered low-class white people by many of the other Europeans. Many of them were essentially expelled, pushed out to different parts, including to parts of the Caribbean, where, yes, they were essentially prisoners that were forced into islands that had incredibly harsh conditions, where the death rate was sometimes 50% annually, but then they also then in turn enacted violence upon the native inhabitants. So there are kind of layers of this kind of colonialism where the Irish themselves were colonized, but then also became colonizer. And of course, same goes for the Scots. The Scots were at first in conflict with England, of course, but later on, especially during the British Raj, they became the McDonald's, they became the primary colonial officers of the regime. Anybody else with questions or questions, comments? Well, I guess I'll prompt Jomo. So I have a question about healthcare, right? The origins of healthcare and medical research, because I think there's something quite interesting there about the IMR and its relation to plantation society as well. If you could maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, the Institute of Medical Research, which was set up here in Malaysia, is actually the first such facility outside of England. So you have the London School of Tropical Hygiene and Medicine, and you have the Liverpool School of Tropical. Now, why Liverpool? Because that's where the main port, right, of people coming into And of course, if you go to Liverpool today, if you're not, besides going for Beatles, you can also go to the Museum of Slavery, okay, where you will see some of the characters I described earlier, because in this particular period, you have in Liverpool very, very complex histories. So one of the primary apologists of British imperialism today is a man at Stanford named Neil Ferguson. Okay? Now, Neil Ferguson basically says, I cannot be racist because I married a Somalian woman. Okay? But more importantly, Neil Ferguson basically is a very clever person. He has a slew of people working for him, and he has written a very, very solid history of the Rothschilds. But in a long piece for the Financial Times, he plays a trick on readers. Okay, so there are many families. Grandfathers are named, the grandchildren are named after their grandfathers, or at least the first grandson is named after the grandfather. So you have families like the Rothschild family, the Nathan Rothschild being the grandson, also being Nathan Rothschild. So you have the whole slavery trade from Liverpool as well as Bristol being financed by a man named Nathan Rothschild. And then Wilberforce succeeds in his anti-slavery movement, slavery ends, and then you have two things. One, you have in Britain manumissions, and manumissions needs to be financed. Okay, compensation for the giving up your slaves, manumissions. Okay, that needs to be financed. Who finances it? Again, the Rothschilds Bank. Okay, so manumissions is financed by the Rothschild, by a head of the bank who is the grandson with the same name. So Ferguson, who knows the difference, plays with the name and makes the argument that that Nathan Rothschild both was involved in the slave trade, but also in ending the slave trade. When you're talking about two different Nathan Rothschilds. I mean, this is what clever people can do, but basically, nonetheless, this is essentially a deception. So, what about the IMR?
I mean, in the medical association,
yeah.
And it's
okay. So, just to give you a sense of what it meant, and Devi might be interested in this, the difference in how should I put it? In 1929, the Nobel Prize for Medicine is given to a British researcher in Malaysia, in Kuala Lumpur, and a Dutch researcher in Batavia. The Dutch researcher in Batavia looks at the effects of feeding different types of food to chickens. And the chickens who eat white rice end up with beriberi. Okay? Here, so why is this happening? And then in Kuala Lumpur, what they did was they went to the mental ward. Okay? No such thing as informed consent. And in the mental ward, they basically did the same thing. So Chinese in the mental ward all eat white rice. Indians eat parboiled rice. Malays, beras tumbuk. Okay, so beras tumbuk, you take off the husk, and you're basically eating the rice with the, it's still red rice, yeah? And none of the Malays got berry. All the Chinese got berry. The Indians, depending on how much was left. So the point being that, you know, what might be called the rice germ was basically had enough vitamin B content to prevent beriberi. Okay? Now, why the difference between the Dutch and the British researcher? The British researcher was not constrained by the ethical movement in Dutch colonialism. So you have this kind of different ideas of what is considered ethical research practice, ethical medical practice, and so on and so forth. Okay? So, I mean, that's just one anecdote, but there are many things. I mean, you know, the problem right now is that there are various trajectory differences, and a lot of research was being done here, not just with Malaya in mind. It was done for the entire British Empire. So very few people, for example, recognize, and why I keep on telling people to read Sultan Nazrin's book on Malayan colonialism in the first 4 decades of the last century. And before that, there was a very good book by Martin Kok Ping on the Malayan economy, again looking at the colonial period and the early post-colonial period. Basically, what comes out very clearly is the importance of Malaya to the British Empire. And in the first half decade, after the end of World War II, the Malayan contribution to the sterling zone, to export earnings for the entire British Empire, constituted 70%. Because remember that Hitler had bombed Britain. There was nothing left of India. You know, this was the home of the Industrial Revolution. But by the time Hitler was through, there was nothing left except a little bit in Glasgow. Okay, because the German planes couldn't reach Glasgow. Okay, that was all that was left. So there's this thing by Vijay Prashad, for example, when he visited Glasgow, where he talks about Glasgow and so on. But this is very important for us to recognize, but we just don't realize it. We don't realize how important we were to the British Empire. Of course, you might say that it was exceptional because of the Korean War, the price of rubber had gone through the roof, the price of tin had gone through the roof and so on, and prices certainly did come down after that. But nonetheless, you know, even before this exceptional period, perhaps right after the end of World War II, this was very important. And likewise, this was reflected in medical research, in health research, health practices. So there were women, for example, there was a woman nutritionist who came from Jamaica, came to Singapore, and was making many recommendations on how to improve nutrition in Malaya. But it was not in the interest of various companies. So what the kind of practice which you would refer to in terms of ICI, what ICI was doing in terms of developing these herbicides in Malaya, similar things were happening in other areas of life, including scientific life as well. So it's very important for us to re-examine these things, but also to look at its contemporary implications. I mean, much of the abandonment of traditional practices has not necessarily always been for the better. It is true that one shouldn't glamorize and, you know, think that everything during the traditional was all wonderful and so on. But at the same time, you look, for example, at the changing diet. Okay, we now have much more obesity among ethnic Chinese in Malaysia because of the changing diet. You know, I mean, you know, an earlier generation, your father's generation, would not dream of drinking bubble tea. The whole, you know, the whole idea of tea is tea, right? Not bubble tea, right? But, you know, you have these kinds of practices. Everything in Malaysia right now is full of sugar. You know, Malaysian Milo is banned in Australia. It has so much sugar that it's banned in Australia. But this is what we all grew up. If you went to a government school, which less and less people go to nowadays, but if you went to a government school, remember school sports day, we all look forward to. The only reason we show up for a sports day if you're not running is you must get that Milo, okay? And that Milo was what we all treasured. So, we have these kinds of this, the trappings of modernity, the trappings of progress, when in fact the path is much more complex and variegated than that.
Yeah, I think in kind of summary is that, I mean, even the medical research, much of it was centered not around saving lives per se, but saying we can't afford the replacement rate of these workers. And that's really how a lot of the origins of our public healthcare system lie. Because they're like, we can't keep replacing these workers. So I think it really has that kind of impact. I think there was a question coming from this side of the room.
Jomo Sharad. Could you tell us a little bit about the ethnic dimension to the plantation question and its long-term consequences? In Malaya, plantations are over, I guess, as an economic system, at least the dominant one. But today, do we still see the consequences of, forms of deprivation or ways in which consciousness was formed in plantation systems that might still exist today?
Yeah, it's quite. I mean, we have a plantation society where I'm quite familiar. I found plantation society quite familiar because I went to a military school. Okay, the hierarchy, hierarchy of military and the hierarchy of plantation are remarkably similar. If you're cycling on the plantation, you come anywhere near the manager, you get off the plantation, get off your bicycle, and you walk, and you bow and so on. Likewise in the military, you don't cycle past a senior officer without paying deference and so on and so forth. These are all the effects of part of this culture. Now, and this is replicated also. One of the reasons I got into trouble in the military school was I did a play. So I don't see anybody from that play, but I did a play called Chips with Everything. It's like going to a satay shop and ordering ketupat with everything, meaning all the free timon and so on without buying any satay itself. Okay, and chips with everything basically implies that. So basically, it's about the culture of the conflict between the privates and the non-commissioned officers, and the corporals and the sergeants and so on and so forth, because these are seen as the immediate oppressor. So Sharad's question becomes extremely important because very often the resentment is not against some big shot living on the hill. It's against the immediate oppressor who is the clerk, who is the, and so on and so forth. And very often there was an ethnic division of labor where most of the okay, so in the union movement, this is replicated through the lowest plantation laborers are in something called the NUPW, National Union of Plantation Workers. In between, there's something else called the All Malayan Estate Staff Union. Okay, J.C. Rajarao has written a book about them, and of course he was commissioned by them, so you don't expect a terribly critical thing, but I think it lends itself to a critical reading. Okay, and likewise in all these things you can You can read these things much more critically than normal. So you basically are able to glean from this. It is very often you have these stereotypes, okay? And so you can have, for example, a lot of resentment by Indian Tamils of Ceylonese Tamils. You have resentments of the Malayalis, resentment of the Telugus, and so on and so forth, which are often related to these kinds of differences. Okay, and likewise, these things are replicated in many other ways in society. But I want, at the same time, just like the Indian Association had those people who were supporting Periyar and the reforms, you also have some who might have been more sympathetic and so on. And so some of the more equalizing moments were things like the INA. A few days ago, Rasama Bhupalan passed away. Okay, and she was with the Rani of Jhansi's regiment. Okay, now when Subhash Chandra Bose organized the INA, the Indian National Army, there was the promise of a certain inequality offered by Subhash Chandra Bose. Well, actually it should be Boshu, but there are very few Bengalis here, so I won't belabor the point. But so Subhash, so you have within that, for example, one of the best known anthropologists of the late 20th century is Arjun Appadure. Okay? Arjun Appadure's father, Mr. Appadure, was actually the propaganda minister, the Goebbels of Subhash Chandra Bose. And where did they meet? They met in Bangkok. Their meetings were in Bangkok. Because Bangkok, Thailand collaborated with the Japanese, and they were exempt. That's why the northern states of the former unfederated Malay states all reverted to Thailand, to Siam, during that period. Okay, so it's a quite a complex thing, but I don't want to for a current generation, this becomes the stuff of myth and prejudice. So you have, for example, there were aspiring MIC politicians who would be who would write off somebody who had some hint of Ceylonese Tamil, ancestry in terms of their politics and so on and so forth. So you have a lot of things which are no longer quite true, but which are based on past practices which have subsequently been mythologized. I don't want to overstate that as well, but as we try to go forward in society, it's important for us to recognize that many of our prejudices are based on myths about real past practices, and this is always very difficult to contend with. But you're quite right in reminding us of the ethnic divisions of labor in plantation society, as in larger societies. I mean, if you think for example, I mean, almost every other doctor who was brought in from India was Bengali. Okay, almost every teacher was Malayali. Tun Mahathir's father was one of those teachers. I remember when I was in school, I had all my science teachers, half my science teachers were not only Malayali, they were actually Syrian Christians. Okay? The doctor in the Kinrara hospital was Tommy Thomas's father-in-law, and so on and so forth. Okay? There was a very clear ethnic division of labor, which was in some ways more pronounced than the ethnic division of labor in the Ottoman Empire. Okay? Many people think that the matriarch, who was so important for three of the leading Johor families, Unku Aziz's family, the Alatas family, as well as the Dato' On's family. That matriarch they always refer to her as Turkish. But when you talk to people in Johor, they will refer to her as Orang Circus. And the reason she's called Orang Circus is because she was actually Circassian. Okay, C with a tail, right? And she was referred to as Orang Circus because people were not familiar with how to pronounce these kinds of names. So you have a lot of, you have ethnic divisions of labor which serve these ends, just like, for example, in plantation societies in the West, the degree of darkness. In Brazil was the last major country to abolish slavery. And that was only because the Portuguese Empire, the Portuguese kingdom was in exile in Brazil. It couldn't survive in Portugal. They had to go to Brazil for half a century. And when the two kings died, the princess became the queen. Well, she wasn't allowed to become the queen, but she was effectively succeeded to the throne, and she abolished slavery in 1885, around the time the Johor Sultanate was created. Now, I think her name was Isabella, I can't remember her name, but she basically created what do you call it? She basically abolished slavery, but the color gradations were very important. So you have, for example, color gradations such as mulatto, preto, and in between, I can't remember all the colors now. But basically, these were all degrees of darkness. Okay? And basically, these were indications about the level of conversely of whiteness. Okay? And there was a hierarchy built on that. So, and there was not a single person of African descent in the entire Brazilian Foreign Service until the 21st century. Okay? Now, these things obviously have very enduring effects. But if you ask any Brazilian, especially a white Brazilian, they would say, oh, well, the Brazilian Foreign Service requirements are very tough. You need to have 4 languages, Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French. And so very few people would qualify for it, and so on and so forth. So you have all these kinds of ways of justifying it, and they're not completely mythical either. You often have these requirements. And so, and so you often have people saying, oh, this fella must be Indian because he's so dark. It couldn't possibly be must be Tamil because he's so dark, and so on and so forth. You often hear these kinds of things being said even to this day. And even in the choice of husbands or wives or partners and so on and so forth, these things are still very, very prevalent. But it doesn't, I'm not sure it really answers your question, but I think there is certainly something to be said about ethnicity as well as color.
Okay, I think we have time for just one last question. If anybody would like to take a shot. Anybody? Oh, yes?
I just want to, if plantation were once the stage of a colonial economy, right? Would you say they are left behind a legacy that still writes a scenes of inequality and exploitation? And how do we like rewrite the script without cutting down the actors that build the play?
I'm not quite sure I understood your question entirely, but I don't think there are any easy answers. I think when Felda morphed, there was a possibility of joint stock ownership by settlers. Okay? If you look at what is now called FGV, the whole idea of originally was to have settlers becoming shareholders. So it opened up the possibility of organizing plantation society differently. Okay, that's at one level. But there's also another level of what kinds of, at a larger level, if you have much more national planning, and I'm thinking, for example, of the kind of transformations which are taking place in China, you can organize society quite differently, where you basically accelerate the transitions away from certain types of practices, and including cropping practices. Okay? So the way the transition happened from rubber to plantations, it was easier for people with capital to make that transition. Yeah? Plantations were able to do it because you can start replanting and you can crop rotate, right? I mean, you can break it down, you can phase it out. If you're a small holder with a small plot of land, how are you going to do that? Even if you have the capital, okay, it's much more difficult, right? So the question is, how do you overcome these kinds of transitional problems? But that is now impossible now, or very difficult to do, because you have a level of concentration of private ownership. So you're leaving it entirely to the plantation companies to make these transitions. There's no coordination with the national level. There was initially the promise of that during the Tun Razak period, because Tun Razak basically did two things which are very important. One, he started nationalizing previously British-owned companies. If you take James Puthucheary's book, Ownership and Control of the Malayan Economy, that became almost like the reference point for which companies were considered worth nationalizing. Okay? Now, many people will say, why you even compensate these guys? Okay, but let's say you want to throw to work through market mechanisms, that was done. But precisely because at that initial point, it was still in private owned hands, it was possible to make the further transition which I was referring to. And to some extent, it did happen, because a lot of the new land which was being opened up during that period, during the 70s especially, after Jangka and so on, offered those kinds of possibilities. But with the 1980s, Tun Mahathir Tun Mahathir basically believed what Mrs. Thatcher was promising. And basically private was best. Okay? And so with that transition, now it's very difficult, because you have very complex ownership issues, and since we believe so much in the rule of law, how are you going to get away from that? So you have a very, very difficult transition ahead. In the case of Indonesia and some other countries, it is possible to make that kind of transition because you have the legacy of transmigrasi and a much more complex ownership arrangements under transmigrasi from Java to the outer islands, okay, basically Kalimantan and so on, right? But elsewhere, it's much more complex. And so I don't, and certainly in Vietnam, it's almost impossible. Yeah. So I think the kind of situation which we have in Malaya is much more limited in the peninsula, much more possible in Sarawak and Sabah because of the more ambiguous ownership arrangements. But it's a very important question you're raising. I would simply add that you do not make that transition should be made not just in the context of what you do in particular enterprises, but also raise the question of what you want to do with the national economy as a whole, right? That is a much more difficult question to be made. You know, do you want to continue, for example, to condemn rice farmers in Muda, for example, to continuing to grow rice, and their incomes will be far, far lower than farmers elsewhere, you know? Because that is the condition for insisting on rice. So there are very complex issues to be considered, but I think the way it is much more difficult to do so now than half a century ago, for example, when Tun Razak opened up that new phase of life and new possibilities were possible during the 70s. So, but thank you very much for that question, and thank you all for your patience for being such a accommodating and patient audience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.